The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss. Welcome to another lecture on the second movement of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, Un Bal. So, this is a continuation of the second appearance of Part A. As you might remember, this is sort of a scherzo or minuet kind of a form. A, B, A, and we saw that the trio was the Idée fixe. And then in the last lecture, we saw how the first part of A had been repeated, but with different orchestration. And that is going to continue. You might remember that there was a general pause, just sort of bringing the entire waltz to a sudden halt. And now the waltz is going to pick up and continue on. And once again, Berlioz is using the same basic melodic and structural elements, but of course with a completely different orchestration. So let's see what that is. It's actually fairly simple. We'll just take the easy route here and run through how the melody is being orchestrated and then all the other elements. Starting off with the top voice, we have got our petite flute, our piccolo, playing the top line, and actually starting in a fairly soft area. This is really almost going into the lower register, which starts right at around G. And then going up into the middle and getting close to the upper register here. I would say anything above A is upper register. And then here we really start to hear the piccolo shine when it gets up to C sharp, B, and so on. Everything below it is just stacked octaves. So we've got the standard flute. Remember that this is the second flute player playing piccolo. So first flute playing an octave below and doubled on that same exact line by oboe and first clarinet. And then an octave below that, we have second clarinet. And that forms a really solid octave. Most of the weight, as you can see, is right in the middle. So it's really flute, oboe, and first clarinet. And then everything on either side is just going along with it and creating a little bit of weight below and above. To be completely honest, the piccolo will have a little bit of shine to it. It won't get really all that much absorbed by the flute, especially if you have a player who's playing out a little bit because they feel like this is their big solo. Well, my feeling about it is that the piccolo should sort of allow themselves to be absorbed into the line, especially when they are playing lower, right? They shouldn't be playing out too much. That's how I would balance it were I conducting this. And then just letting their resonance come out a little bit as they started to crest the melodic arc here. That is a cool triple octave melody. Now, it's being supported with this wonderful warm center here of horns. I think I already pointed out how interesting it was that we had a C horn that was more or less just playing E octaves. Occasionally you would see a D, right, and D seconds, C sharp thirds, but nothing too far out of what the available harmonic series notes would be. Now here we've got our E, not E flat, but E horn, and that gives us a C sharp sixth, which would intersect with these E octaves, making an A major 6/4 chord and so on. I'm not going to analyze all of this harmony for you, and actually I believe I've already supplied some of that in the intro of how the E horns would work alongside the C horns and so on. In fact, I think this entire passage was broken down into concert pitch on a grand staff, so you can check that out if you want to. But the main takeaway here is that you've got this lovely push on the third beat, not too strongly. People have a tendency to overinterpret accents if they come from an intermediate piano background. Just a little bit of a push here, emphasis with the player's breathing, shoving that third beat a little bit and then resolving into the downbeat. You know, da, da, da. And actually, that same pulse is played around with a little bit in other parts of this movement, but not in this way. But what's cool about this is it's a harmonic pad, but it's used rhythmically. And it doesn't really settle until you get to right here. And these would be A major chords, right? So this would be an A major 6-3 chord with the root on the top. And this written A is C sharp, doubling this C sharp an octave below written, and then this E, of course, is concert pitch an octave down. You can work all this out for yourself. One thing that I left out a little bit, more or less on purpose, was discussing the role of the harps here. You'll notice in most recordings that you can't really hear the harps until really right around here, and what you hear is the rolling of these chords. So despite Berlioz's best intentions here, this is a somewhat unnecessary line. You could argue, well, it's tone weight. If you take it out, maybe it'll subtract something from the music, and I would just have to say, I don't think it subtracts anything from the music to leave the harps out here. However, were I conducting this, I would not tell the harpists to leave it out because they've studied that line, and them playing it will bring them some enjoyment. So that is something in there for them, the way that I see it. Sort of like the big rolling chords in the slow section of Jupiter from the planets. By the time you get to the end of that section, the harps become invisible because of the weight of sound from all the other instruments. However, at that point, those rolled chords are really for the harpist, so that they can join in this massive hymn, right, and feel like they're part of it. So I don't really think that was Berlioz's intention here, but it may as well be to have the harpist just move along. And if you were sitting right in front of the harpist in the audience, or if you were the conductor with the harpist right on either side of you, then you would hear it with no problem, especially with 4 harp players. I would really like to hear this played with 4 harpists playing modern instruments, rather than, say, if they had some reconstructions or historical instruments of the period, the sort of lighter harp that was available in Berlioz's time, which, of course, probably caused him to ask for A4 harps. Somebody brought up a really interesting point after I released the intro lecture. They had pointed out that I had said somewhere that adding harps doesn't necessarily make them louder. And that is true, but it has to do with tone weight. There can be the presence of the tone, and it can be sort of overwhelmed by the other instruments. But adding more to them, while it doesn't really make it louder, say if you were to record solo harp and then record 2 harps, you wouldn't really see the waveform from a digital recording getting all that much louder. But what it does do is it sort of bulks up the tone so that it becomes clearer. It can become a little too clear. For instance, when Wagner asks for tripled harps, he's having 3 strings, one from each separate harp, play the same tone at the same time. And to me, that feels like a piano. Pianos have tripled courses. Asking for triple harps on one tone kind of feels like a piano to me. Of course, it's a very glittery, beautiful, radiant sound, and it is harp-like, but it still kind of lacks that wonderful individuality and mystery. But I would still like to hear A2 standard harps on each part so that you would get this A4. I just think it would be interesting. Having said that, you'll notice that even in a few period performances that are on YouTube. There's a really great one from Orchestra of the Revolution and Romantic period, conducted by Roger Norrington. It just has 2 harps instead of 4, and they're modern harps, I believe, rather than period harps. That's loud enough, really. But to get back to this particular phrase right in here, I don't think it would matter if you had A4 modern harps. I don't think the tone would bulk up enough for this to really stand out as a useful line, but leave it in. Jumping back down to the strings, we have some really basic waltz type stuff going on, just hitting the 1s and the 5s at first and then moving on into the other harmonic positions as the music progresses for the lower strings. And then you've got the pa to the right in here, this pluck 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 pluck, just lovely little chords from our middle strings, and then this ba 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 ba. That's really kind of fun, and it shows that Berlioz was hip to what was going on in the ballroom. Now, this is my favorite part right in here. This ba da 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 really has a wonderful sense of static holding on. When you think about it, it's that same melody, just adding a few more notes, but it isn't changing to the 5 in the middle. Right? It is just kind of holding on to that A major chord in the horns and in the first violins. And then we've got that wonderful lift. Once again, Berlioz is really, really aware of what's going on in the ballroom, and knowing that certain phrases, certain parts of each 4 bars or each 8 bars, there would be an expectation that you would maybe lift your partner, or you would sort of dip with them, or you would exaggerate something as the music slowed down. I'm sure all of that stuff, within the short few years that the waltz became this huge international craze, that was all worked out by dancing teachers, dancing specialists, ballroom mavens, and everybody else who was out there having a good time in the ballroom, if you were rich and snooty or whatever. Now, moving onwards, let's take the same approach as before, just really looking at the melody and then the harmony and then any rhythmic accompaniment and so on. Now here we have the other side of that phrase. Da, 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 da. Same exact strategy, except we have this massive quadruple unison. The second clarinet has given up playing the octave below. Now notice the use of the word unis, right? Unison. This is a little distracting. It's something that you shouldn't use on wind parts. Unison and divisi is something that is the basic property of groups of instruments that are more than just 2 or 3 on a staff. So for instance, you might see divisi and unison in brass band parts, where you've got several cornets on the same staff. And of course, you see it in string parts, where it's used most commonly. So don't use unison, use A2. Okay? So it's just kind of strange that A2 and unison and so on are used interchangeably. Here you see unison again used in the horn parts. But this just puts all the weight right on that same octave with flute, oboe, and 2 clarinets now. And then the piccolo following an octave above. And I have to say that the piccolo can easily outplay everybody once things get up to here. Now notice that the piccolo is harmonizing. Da, 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 da. And then in the flute, da, 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 da. We've got that same harmony happening here in the strings, right? Coming off of their ba, da, da, ba, da, da, ba, da, da. And the harps are sort of playing along. I feel it's just a little bit more fuss than it's worth. If I were composing this work, I would probably leave out this melodic stuff, because it forces the harpist to change the pedal to D sharp and then back to D natural, and it's very pianistic, really, in a way. where just these beautiful gushing chords make a lot more of an impact to the music, and the melody doesn't really come out. It's interesting, though, that Berlioz is considering that there could be harmony in the harp parts, the C sharp right here and the E there, and then the walking down in thirds. And then, of course, E here, G sharp there. And here we've got octaves apart. The two first harps are playing this an octave higher than the two second harps. Now, as this progresses, of course, the flute and the piccolo become unified, right? So we've got the flute reaching up to that high F sharp and the piccolo doubling it. And that pretty much continues all the way through until you get to here, where they jump 2 octaves apart again. And this really puts a lot of weight on that upper part. And it's more than matched below by the oboe and the 2 clarinets, but it really will cut through this upper line right in here. Especially when you've got the string doubling, it'll really make that string line very, very thick, silky, and penetrating. Now, looking at the horns, we've got that same push on the third beat, relaxing into the first beat of the next bar, and so on. And once again, we get to the A major pad and the ba-da-da-ba-da-da idea with the violins, here with the seconds coming in and harmonizing. And then, of course, what's interesting here is that the sense of pulse is a little bit interrupted, isn't it? We don't have that same boom, chuck, chuck, boom, chuck, chuck going on in every bar. The waltz is sort of allowed to develop emotionally rather than just physically. That's what I feel is really genius about this movement, is the emotional development, rather than just keeping up a steady pa all the way through and forcing the listener to think of the physicality of it constantly. He's really projecting a kind of yearning, and that matches up with the whole mating ritual of ballroom dancing, of meeting a partner and flirting and dancing with them and having that close contact without it really being all that intimate. But there is also something shared in that dancing that goes beyond just a hello. It's sort of a way of releasing social tension, isn't it? All of these soirees and ballroom dances and so on. And Berlioz gets to the heart of that in the context of his artist's search for romantic fulfillment from his perfect woman. So that's all mixed up together in this wonderfully epic light scoring. I find that contradiction also very wonderful. That he's able to put so much serious emotion and thought into something that is kind of a bit of fluff. It's the kind of pop stuff of the day, and so wise of him to make this the second movement of his work. I'm sure that helped to boost the popularity with people who really weren't paying that much attention, but enjoyed a good night out at the concerts every once in a while. It's, once again, obsessively devious and also very honest at the same time. And we've got these little chuck-chucks, this time arco rather than pizzicato. And at this point, the music starts to hurry up, get towards that sort of frantic, whirling quality of the waltz. Now, we're going to keep going, and it's kind of hard to sort of stop here because the music continues on and develops and reveals new things. So let's just add a couple more pages. It should only be 3. I like to do about 3 screens before playing the music. But there is so much to say about this, even though you can see that the basic architecture of the orchestration here is very simple. But there is a lot going on, so let's keep going a little bit. Something that tends to get lost here is this little counter melody, kind of walking down here to C sharp from A. Da-da-dun, da-da-dum. As the music starts to go ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. This, although it kind of looks like a rhythmic part, is actually a continuation of the melody. We can see that everybody's playing a C sharp here. Flutes, piccolo an octave higher, oboe doubling the flute, first clarinet doubling the flute, octave lower. We have this C sharp, middle C sharp, and that is being doubled by A2, not unison. All right, get this unison thing out of your head. If you are thinking of scoring something in a similar style, don't use unison, use A2. This line doubling that second clarinet. And we see here, if you were kind of not paying attention or not that familiar with this, that really was just the beginning of this little gesture. And pretty much everybody stays in their lane. Right? There are no changes, there's no doublings, there's no jumping up to another level of our triple octave here. Piccolo stays where it is, doubling at an octave above the flute, oboe, and first clarinet, and second clarinet is doubled by first and second horns. And then there's this rushing up here, ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-bum, and I really love how the horns are supplying the thirds, and those thirds are enough to color the entire triple octave run. So there's really no need for the other instruments to supply any more harmony than that, because the resonance of the horn is so powerful that it will inform the melody here with that harmonization just fine. Now right here you have these arpeggios. That's kind of like slow broken chords, slow rolls, right? And then here the harps come in and play along with the melody, and here's where they disappear. It's kind of interesting because all of this is very audible. You know, you'll hear this lovely glittering roll right in here, and this one will come through fairly well too. But right in here, you may have some trouble distinguishing it because it's doubling at pitch, right, rather than rolling over different chordal notes. And then right in here, they sort of pick up this lovely arpeggio. And this will fit into the hand of the harp perfectly well. So left hand grabbing these three notes and the right hand getting these four above. Beneath, the lower strings are just chugging along on those kind of 16th notes. And we see the scoring of the measured tremolo right in here. And here's this counter melody, which is just so easy to ignore, to just not pay attention to. And you can see that it just repeats itself again. A walking down to C sharp and then B, A, A, as we saw here too. And then Berlioz harmonizes it. So A and C sharp. So walking down thirds. And then that repeats itself. And then here, as the harps react to the winds and horns rushing up to this C sharp, the violins really come into their own. Crescendo molto and then going da 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 da. And that's what enables them to catch the ear, so the listener feels this natural progression to the first violins going da 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 da. This is just the simplest kind of scoring, isn't it? With the second violins just adding a little bit of harmonic context on that second beat, and then the lower strings essentially playing octaves, the violas doubling the cellos, and then the double basses playing an octave below that. Notice how Berlioz just really justifies having a separate staff for the double basses, rather than having the two parts on the same staff. And that's something he undoubtedly learned from Beethoven after discovering his scores within the decade that he composed this piece. Here Berlioz drops the piccolo because he doesn't want that cutting sound, right? He just wants more integrated, softer harmony coming here from his winds and horns. And it's all pretty simple. This is sounding F sharp. This is a D fifth. This is oboe and flute doubling on that D. And It's interesting that this F sharp just supplies all of the context of the chord that you need. Once again, there doesn't need to be an overemphasis on the harmonization. Just really, really great lessons in simplicity here. And as the line descends in the violins, we see the winds coming in here and doubling at the octave above and at pitch here on the clarinets, and then just gracefully unifying right in here. This is kind of cool how the violins go as low as they possibly can and then jump up B to G sharp here, and the other instruments' arcs can be more complete, especially the clarinet reaching all the way down to this written G sounding E. So it's just wonderful how the instruments can compensate for one another in this sort of situation, and just so gracefully done, the way the winds come back into the picture as melodic elements. Then we have our horns just pacing right on the beat right in here, and the other elements of the triple meter pulse chugging along as well in the middle and lower strings. Here on this next page, you can see right away why I decided to add a fourth screen before playing the music for you. And that is that really essentially this just happens again, the same way that it was orchestrated before. There are some differences, and I'll point them out. But you can see that we've got the piccolo on the top, we've got the flute, oboe, and first clarinet, all kind of playing unison together. We've got the second clarinet and unison, A2, E-flat horns, doubling on that C sharp below. Now just remember your transposition if this is kind of leaving you a little bit behind. Down a minor third from E is C sharp, right? Down a minor sixth from A is C sharp. So they're basically just playing the same thing. Sometimes when you know the transposition of something, you don't have to look at every single note in the transposed part. You can just observe the parts that it's doubling that are written in C and say, oh yeah, of course, that's just an octave down or whatever. And here, as this line goes towards the end, you can see, once again, the harmonization in the horns. Once again, the kind of glittering commentary in the first and second harp. Same thing, sort of reaching higher the second time, and adding this doody-doody-doody in the first harps. Here, once again, I'm afraid this will sort of disappear into the horns and winds. And this rushing upwards kind of adds a little something, but it's so easily overwhelmed by the horns that are going to be on the same pitches as the lower strings, and then of course the overtones from the horns, which are going to kind of swallow what's going on in the upper staff. Okay, so the counter melody, which is kind of my favorite part here, and which just is so easy to ignore. We've got the same thing happening, but in octaves, and then it repeats itself. And if you recall, after repeating itself, it harmonized, right? So here it's going to harmonize at that higher position. Rather than everything being kind of in the staff, we'll have that high C sharp, and then the seconds right underneath it. And of course, this is just setting up the return of the strings as a vital element to the melody, which will happen on the next screen. And the lower strings are just chugging along, playing these octaves, octave A's, just continuing on, and then the cellos and basses jump up, so this is doubled, and then the violas jump up, so it's once again a triple octave. That's not that hard to read. So let's listen to it now. And as you listen to it, I'm going to actually play two different versions. There's something I've been holding back from you throughout the entire second movement, and I felt that I would make a separate video about this, but I think I can just sort of sneak this in. And that is the role of the cornet. Now, I mentioned in the introduction video that Berlioz had written an obligato cornet part for this, and I said initially he had written it but then left it out when the work was published. And somebody jumped on whether that was in the first or second draft, but really what I meant by initially was that before the work was published, Berlioz had written this cornet part, not whether it was in the first draft or second draft or whatever. And here's the interesting thing. In this Ortext edition, which I believe is of the first manuscript, they are choosing to leave out the cornet part. In this kind of late 19th century, early 20th century edition that is also on IMSLP, they put it back in, but as a miniature staff. Let's take a quick look at that now. Jumping back to right before the general pause, we've got that same melody. And here you can see the cornet comes in, and it's basically playing along the same way. Cornet in A, actually. It's really hard to read this. I know. I apologize for the kind of scratchiness of the image, but that's just the way the scan was uploaded to IMSLP. You can see that the cornet part kind of complements the melody, sometimes harmonizes it, sometimes plays inside it, sometimes doubles it. And I feel like this is the only place in this movement where the cornet part really becomes potentially obtrusive, where it's something that you really start to hear. So I feel that from here, after the general pause, to the onomato, to, is where the cornet really starts to stand out, because it's that kind of music, right? And as you probably heard in the intro video, there is a real danger of the cornet overplaying. And I actually supplied an example of that. So here's what we're going to do in our listening session for this section of the work. First, I'm going to play you a recording that has no cornet, along with the Ortext edition that also has no cornet staff on the score image. Then I'm going to play you a recording where the cornet player gets it right, where they are a part of the music, you can hear them, but they don't necessarily swamp the winds and horns. Having said that, you will still hear that the cornet part kind of takes something away from the color and individuality of the winds. And I believe that that is why Berlioz eventually decided to abandon it in his published score. You can see that the cornet goes all the way up to the beginning of the onomato. Then on that next screen, it comes in, and this is the kind of playing that cornets do really, really well. That kind of repeated, really brisk kind of playing. Then I would say from 34 onwards, the cornet pretty much just blends in with the strings, gives them some life, gives them some energy, some color, and so on. And I'm not going to overdo that. I feel that this is the place where the cornet sticks out the most, up to right around here. So that's really what we should look at for comparison. So listen for all the things that I discussed, the wonderful power and fluidity of this double and triple octave scoring for the melody, and the lovely counter melody in the strings. Here, of course, opening out, getting bigger into octaves, and then higher into these lovely thirds. The role of the harps. Listen for how well you feel the harps contribute right in here to the first couple of beats of this bar. I feel that they get swallowed a little bit, but it's probably better to include them than not. Then, of course, here we sort of see the entire arc of this idea of the onomato sort of pushing, getting higher, and the strings doing their counter melody, and then kind of walking down into this and pulling up into being the melodic lead for the next 8 bars. One thing to note, I would say, is just the lovely character of these second beat winds. Just that little push. And notice how it is an accent without being loud. It's just a prominent note, but soft. On these earlier pages, listen for how the horns work in their little 3-1, 3-1 kind of pad in the background. And then, of course, when they go to the A major, how the kind of swirling, circling violins create this wonderful feeling of nostalgia and emotion and longing. And, of course, how Berlioz sort of pulls the rug of the pulse out from under the music right in here, just basically leaving it to the harp for this bar. And then, of course, nobody really gets that pa pulse unless you consider these circling strings above to be the pulse. I feel it's more of a impulse than a pulse. And of course, that same section right in here in its first introduction. Listen for all of those things with this score and a version that does not include cornet. Then we'll look at the score that does include cornet, along with a recording where I feel that the cornet player really got it right and didn't overplay their part. And then I will see you on the other side for the last two screens of this lecture. And now for two more pages of this coda. That big race upwards ends on this lovely A major chord. And the violins take over on the melody. As you recall, the last time that this happened, the first violins continued onwards and took over the melody from their counter melody. Now, in this case, because both groups of violins were playing in a harmonized version the second time, they are continuing on with that harmonization, as you can see here, B and D, A and C sharp. And then, halfway through the bar, they change to unison octaves, jumping up here to this E, and then slowly working their way down. Really is lovely, and it goes to show that even though you can have a really big mass of horns and winds, and they can be very bright and very loud, the strings can take over in a situation like this and seem incredibly strong, just so long as they are accompanied quite lightly, and you can actually see that here. You've got these double stops in your violas and cellos, and you've got these boop boops, boop boops going on in your winds and horns now, and then this lovely icing from the harp. But keeping it simple in the way that we've done before, now that we've easily defined the melody for the first half of this screen, let's really observe the details of that accompaniment. Starting with the strings, pretty simple here, just hitting G's and a middle C right there in the middle. These are all intended to be double stops, and they're all very easy to play. F-sharp thirds in both violas and cellos, with an F-sharp below on the double basses. And this looks pretty close together, but it's actually an augmented second, right? So it feels like a third. It will sound like a third to the ear. F, and then G sharp. Essentially implying that all the harmony here is really a G sharp diminished, right? So G sharp, B, D, F would be the way you would spell that out. So you end up with an augmented second here, and that's really easy to play. Under the fingers, it's like a minor third on F. So really no big deal. But once again, just illustrating that if you have a specific harmonic idea in mind that you intend to express, then it's better to use the correct spelling rather than dumbing it down for what you perceive would be convenient for the strings. The strings can figure out how to play an augmented second just fine, right? And so on. These are all very easy to play. I really love the polonaise or mazurka feel to this. Da-da-da. You know, 1, 2, da-da, 2, da-da, da-da. Really has a nice lift to that third beat. And then on top of that, very, very simple scoring. Flute and oboe doubling each other. And then below that, we've got sounding D fifth and so on. Right here, this would be sounding F sharp, and then the D below it, sounding down an octave. So very simple harmony being played by A2, not unison, horns. So that just leaves the glittering harps. And if this page is balanced sensitively enough, you will hear the plucking of these octaves on the downbeat. But it is so easy to swallow them just in the context of everything else that is going on. You may feel a distant sense of plucking on these octaves, but essentially they just disappear, and you really only feel the downbeat on these accents or first notes of the bar in the strings. But even if that doesn't balance out, you'll still be able to feel, if not completely hear, this glittering background here of arpeggiated chords in the right hand. And that's really what gives these 5 bars their very radiant quality. Now, halfway through this screen, as you'll see, the winds come back in, with flute and oboe doubling on the same notes as the first violins, and with clarinets playing A2 on the same group of notes that's being played by the second, but just not broken up into sixteenths with these gestural slurs. That's fine, it just gives a little bit of tone weight and context behind the second violins, joining up with the firsts right in here. And if the balance is right, then it will feel more like radiant, strong strings, rather than the winds coming in and just dominating. And then, of course, you've got piccolo on top. And here is a place where I would want the piccolo player to tone it down. As you heard in that last musical example without the cornet, the piccolo was really pretty loud. And that's probably just because of the way that they mic'd that particular performance rather than the piccolo player intending to play over, but they could have toned it down a bit. Now here you see the instruments racing upwards, and really, where are they headed? The implication is that they are headed for high A here, and they just poop out at around here on F sharp. So the audience will sort of fill in their mind that the instruments raced all the way up to a high A. However, if they did fulfill that high A, then you would either have to hear the instruments drop down, or Berlioz would have to continue onwards and throw in a very high C sharp when he got to here. It would sound quite high and piercing, especially considering that your piccolo would be going out of range to its high C sharp. And even at that, when you get really, really high on a piccolo, say playing all the way up on A above this A, it just really becomes this slightly square, blocky note trying to force itself into your ear and is not all that pleasant. And of course, it just tends to dominate the color of everything. So it's a bit of a compromise. However, part of the illusion here is in the rushing upwards of this lower line. And what happens is that there's a sense of telescoping because this line is actually racing up to this A here. So unless you're really listening for it and saying, aha, here's that section where Berlioz had to compromise about running all the way up to an A and then not actually getting there and just jumping down back into the register where he started. Unless you're really paying attention to that, then you won't even notice it because of the way this runs up to here. That's just part of it. And a really good reason for the way that this entire line set that up, right? So you get the power of the octave right in here, and then you get this way of softening the jump back down and the abortive run up to A. I'm sure that little dance hall orchestras had compromises like this all the time, where they had a big gesture that swooped upwards, but then they didn't quite get there because no instrument can really play as high as what would happen afterwards if they just stayed up in the high register to which they were headed. Now here, Berlioz is scoring big chords for his harps, and it's getting to a place where it's very hard to balance so that the harpists are audible. Most recordings that I've heard tend to just bury the harps here, and it's basically just because of the fortissimo being played here by the horns and the clarinets. Very little can survive in terms of harp playing in front of that. And of course the strings are just joining in on complementary pitches. So am I saying that Berlioz may as well have not put the harps in right here? Not really, because maybe there's a way. Do you know what I mean? It's not a completely wasted gesture, but it's nothing that I would score in that context. Just one final observation before I turn the page, and that is that the horn scoring and clarinet scoring and so on, the double stops here in the string section, it's all very workable. Very easy stuff to play. This open G down here with an octave on top, it's all really simple. And same thing right in here. We've got a high C sounding A, E sounding C sharp. So it's all going to sound great. And actually, I love the idea of stacking clarinets on top of horns in this context. I feel that that's a really strong sound. Now, I see what Berlioz was thinking right here, and that is that there would be enough distance between the clarinets and the horns. The horns look like they're being scored in a kind of upper middle range, but actually everything is sounding down either a minor sixth or an octave, right? So everything is a lot lower than you might expect just by looking at this. And what is playing in that register? Well, a lot of the tones in these harp chords are playing in that register. So you would think that they would stand out more. But adding fortissimo strings to that same register, there ends up not being that much room for the harps to be audible. Going on, once again, let's focus on melody, then accompaniment. First violins are carrying that forwards. They jump down to these C-sharp thirds and are joined by the second violins, and then they leap upwards to this harmony right in here, and it's harmonized, this leap. E to A, C sharp to E, and so on. And at that point, they just basically become a harmonic element. Now, what is everybody else doing at the same time? This is quite interesting. Just focusing on the flute and the oboe, doubling each other, and not on the piccolo, an octave higher, you can see that when these instruments jump down here to this E, they don't harmonize. So you do not have to double everything for a rich, satisfying chord or harmony. And it also keeps things very, very direct. Now, would I harmonize it? Probably. Then things leap up here to this E, and there's this real great arpeggiation here, just arcing over a fairly small area within the harmony, not really covering the extent of an octave till we get to the end of this bar. And of course the piccolo above, here's a situation where the real intense sound is going to be complemented by the piccolo rather than overwhelmed by it. And that would be true as well of all of this going up towards here. Of course, a very excited piccolo player can really dominate, so it's not a completely foolproof situation. What's cool here is that the clarinets and oboe are playing a simple A major triad, right? So this will sound A and C sharp with the E on top. And that's just so fun. It's so simple and direct and in your face, but it is exactly what needs to happen there. And of course, they are basically just playing on the overtones of this big fat chord down here, which is E octave, sounding an octave lower, and a C sharp sixth from your E horns. And that blazing sound, fortissimo, really beautiful, rich chord, is going to warm up everything that's going on in these last 4 bars. And it just really sounds so exciting. It's this moment of supreme emotional excitement and fulfillment. You can see the artist in Berlioz's imagination fulfilling his desire to dance with the object of his affections in some hallucinatory dream. But of course, it is all in his imagination. The harps may get a little swallowed by the motion of the winds up here and by the tremolo of the strings, but there will still be a kind of glittering quality to the harmony that's going on in here. I think Berlioz is experimenting a little bit with scoring for harps, using them not purely for their audibility, but also for what they can bring to the sound picture. And here, that works great. In previous bars here, I don't think it really makes a huge difference whether the harps are there or not. But if I were conducting this, I would leave them in, and I would have them play what they play and not mess with it. Now, all of this is leading to this really wonderful release. A lot of people think of music as a series of tensions and releases. And I don't know, there's much more going on than that. But we are about to see the tension of this cadence being released into just a wonderfully still, peaceful, serene moment. But that will be coming in the next lecture. For now, I want you to listen for a lot of those things that I talked about. The beautiful, wonderful, radiant quality of these last 4 bars. The great way that the strings dive down to these thirds right in here. And then, of course, the doubling from the winds and how measured that is, culminating in this wonderful leap upwards. See if you can hear any harps going on whatsoever in the recording, both in these 5 bars and this section right here from V. They'll probably be more audible leading up to that section right in here. But does that mean that they're completely useless? I do not agree with that. I feel that they add something even when they are inaudible, but that one shouldn't waste the harpist's time with a lot of real complex scoring if that's what you intend to do, because that is wasted. This is very direct, easy chord kind of playing, and will not really require a whole lot of practice from the harpist. However, if you score something for the harpist and you know that it's not going to be heard, and it's very complicated and difficult to play and does not really add very much to the music, you're really wasting that player's time, and it's a bit of an insult, because why are you using them in that way if they can't be heard? Why are you putting them to all that work? Would you agree to do that kind of work if you weren't going to be heard? Think about that. And then, of course, the way that the violins come in right here, and they've got this lovely dotted rhythm below, creating more interest in the pulse, and especially in the way that that sets up the third beat. And this little bonk, 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 bonk from winds and horns. Have fun with that, and I will see you very soon for the last lecture of Movement 2 from Symphonie Fantastique.